I'll just say very briefly, welcome Phil de Souza, who's Associate Professor at University College Dublin, and most well known to us for his work on piracy in the ancient world, his book with Cambridge in 1999. And today he's going to speak to us about Odysseus as a pirate. So welcome, Phil, and I'll turn things over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. A very quick thank you to Altai, to Andrew, Madeline, and everyone involved. I'm sorry I couldn't actually be with you today, but this event unfortunately coincides with the day that my daughter's junior school are putting on their school musical, and since she has a starring part, I have to be there, which also means I will have to depart in about an hour's time. Okay, Odysseus the Pirate is a really old question. More or less ever since the Odyssey has been available for people to listen to and read, people have been querying whether Odysseus, who after all is called the sacker of cities, does what it says on his label and might therefore reasonably be called a pirate. It kind of depends on what you think pirates are and how you understand pirates. There is a kind of popular perception of pirates, which would be this sort of thing. This is a little drawing from one of the Asterix books, Asterix in Britain. Now, sorry, that just doesn't work in antiquity, because people flying skull and crossbones flags saying, look at us, we are pirates, is a very, very much later thing. The only people who really ever sort of self-declared themselves as pirates were the pirates of the Anglo-American, Caribbean, and Atlantic in the early 18th century. So it therefore really does matter how you define pirates or piracy, and this has been something I've done a lot of work on, and I have boiled it down to a very basic definition. I think the best way to define piracy is armed robbery involving the use of ships, and it's the use of ships largely by the pirates that essentially differentiates them from bandits. The modus operandi of pirates is seafaring or using ships. But it's also important to understand that it's armed robbery. The violence and the plundering of others are essential items in this. But while we are fairly familiar with the parameters of a label of pirate, and we have a reasonably clear understanding of what we think constitutes piracy, it's worth appreciating that pirate and piracy are very subjective labels. They tend to be applied to others in order to differentiate them in some way. And they have an origin that goes back to the Greco-Roman world and its development into the rather restrictive sense of illegitimate armed robbers is something that occurs during Greco-Roman antiquity and is essentially for political purposes. They imply illegitimacy, unlike warfare, which is and often was in the ancient world a legitimate form of violence, usually involving plundering. But of course, in terms of methods, in terms of what people are actually doing, they are essentially the same. And with that idea in mind, you can look at Odysseus and many of the things he either does or says he has done or are referred to by others in the Odyssey and ask the question, well, does this make him a pirate? Is that piracy? And it enables us to appreciate Homer because you can answer the question both ways. Yes, it is. Well, no, it isn't. Or, well, it depends. And that, I think, is one of the intriguing elements of all of the Homeric poems, and particularly the Odyssey. There are many different Odysseus's, And depending on your subjective point of view, you can look at one and say, this is the Odysseus that I think is key. Or you can look at another one and say, no, actually, I think it's a different kind of Odysseus. Important to note that words that can be translated as and become key words for pirates and piracy make their earliest appearance in the Homeric poems. If you go online and look for Odysseus the Pirate or pirates in Homer or ancient pirates, you will find a lot of reference to things like, piracy has been around for thousands of years. There are lots of pirates around in the Bronze Age, but I think that's fundamentally incorrect because there are no words that we can detect in any of the Bronze Age languages that actually mean specifically or can be translated as pirates or piracy. It's first in the Odyssey and later also in one of the Homeric poems that we get this quite well-known question that is asked a couple of times. "O strangers, who are you? From where have you come along the sea lanes? Are you traveling for trade?" Option one. Or are you just roaming about like pirates? And the word used there is lestres, who are people who risk body and soul bringing harm to others. So yes, you're using ships, but are you using them for trade or for piracy? Funny aside, the first point at which this question is asked in the Odyssey is when Telemachus and his companions have reached Pylos and have been welcomed by Nestor, taken part in the sacrifice, who then turns around and says, "Oh, by the way, are you pirates?" But perhaps the more interesting point at which is asked is by Polyphemos, the Cyclops, in the narration of Odysseus's early wanderings after he leaves Troy. And that's one of a number of episodes that I want to just look at in a little bit more detail and invite you to consider for yourselves. Is Odysseus a pirate? Is that piracy? The first episode that Odysseus narrates when he's telling the Phaiakians who he is and what happened to him after the Trojan War is his raid on the Kikonians, who are a Thracian people, as far as we can judge, who occur briefly or get mentioned briefly in the Iliad as allies of the Trojans. So he says, "I sailed from Ilium and the wind brought me to the town of the Kikonians. I sacked the town and killed the men. I took the women and the chattels and divided them up amongst my men." So there were these men arrived in ships, they attacked, they killed, they plundered, and that clearly could be interpreted as piracy, at least from the point of view of the victims. And then Odysseus says, "I was for getting out of there. One of the advantages for pirates of having ships is they can make a quick exit." But as seems to happen quite often when Odysseus is in charge or leading any kind of expedition, his men don't follow his advice and he doesn't have very good control over them. And they sit down, have a barbecue party on the beach, and are driven back by a counterattack. So that's our first encounter with Odysseus and his men behaving like pirates. I will move over the Cyclops episode and come back to it because it's worth noting that there are other references in the Odyssey to people who are pirates or people who are directly labeled as pirates. And there's a very strong theme that they are people who deserve to be dealt with harshly, who deserve a fate of the kind that Zeus reserves for those who behave badly because of the way they have carried out their violent plundering. And that's why one of the passages I mentioned in the abstract is the point in which the suitors, having failed to intercept Telemachus on his way back, are now plotting to kill him when he gets back to Ithaca. And Penelope has a go at them and says, "Really, receivers of mercy to plot against the givers. Such a thing is sacrilege." In particular, addressing Antinoös, she says, "Don't you remember that your father got into trouble with the people here because he joined the Taphian pirates using Laersteres again, to harass the Thesprotians, who are friends of ours. So the problem was that Antinoös's father went on a raiding and plundering expedition, but against the wrong people, against friends. And the people he was participating with are therefore reasonably labeled as pirates. And it's only Odysseus who prevented the Ithacans from killing Antinoös's father and taking all of his goods. You get there a sense of whether or not somebody is deserving of the label pirates depends partly on who they are attacking. Odysseus himself assumes the guise of somebody who might be considered a pirate when he's spinning his tale to Eumaios the swineherd, in which he says, "I'll tell you the whole truth," but of course, being Odysseus, he doesn't, and gives himself an alter ego. He describes himself as a Cretan, the son of Kastor, and he gives a sort of précis of his achievements. And this is, I've used here the Fitzgerald translation because I think it's a very evocative and very effective one, in which he draws attention to the fact that he enjoyed raiding people by ship and plundering them and getting rich in the spoils and even more in division. And that's what gives him his status. So this is one of those cases where Odysseus gives a sort of parallel life in his assumed identity, which largely is the same as the kind of life that he has in what you might call his real identity. Again, I bring you back to the fact that Odysseus is called the sacker of cities. Read the label. That's what he does. But, and I'm moving now to a précis that he gives of the same story when he's talking to the suitors, and he has to be more or less consistent because Eumaios the swineherd is there and listening to him tell the same tale. But he says, Zeus chose to give me a bad end or a bad fate because he made me go to Egypt with a company of pirates. And this is, I think, quite deliberately paralleling the story about Antinoös's father. If you take up with the wrong people and go and attack the wrong enemies, that's where you become pirates, or almost pirates. Because Odysseus says, I took up with this bunch of pirates and we raided and we did some plundering, but then once again, everybody refuses to follow Odysseus's directions and they stay around. There's a counterattack and they're all captured. Odysseus himself is captured, but manages to plead for his life and eventually gets away. Now, what's interesting about this version of Are You a Pirate or Not is Odysseus somehow manages to create a very slight distance between the pirates and himself. He never actually puts himself as one of them. They're a group of people I ended up with, and they get their just desserts, but somehow Odysseus doesn't quite deserve the fate that Zeus has given to the others. And I think this is one of those places where you can see the poet of the Odyssey almost playing with the status of Odysseus as part of his transformation that is one of the themes of the entire poem. So are Odysseus and his men pirates? Are they just sailing around? Are they even perhaps soldiers? This is something that clearly interested, amused, and I think concerned a number of scholars in antiquity. We have a couple of versions of the Cyclops incident in ancient Greek comic literature. We know, for example, that the comic poet, the Athenian comic poet Cretanus, who's active around the same sort of time as Aristophanes, wrote a play called The Odysseuses. Now, it would be lovely to have all of that play. We just have a few fragments. But one that I draw your attention to is one quoted, in fact, by Antinoös, because it's relevant to how you cook things, in this case, Odysseus and his crew, in which he says, in a parody of the dialogue in Book 9, of the Odyssey. I'll seize all of you loyal comrades, as you call yourselves, and whichever of you soldiers, and he uses very clearly the term stratiotai, soldiers, men who are on a military expedition, seems the best cooked, is the one I'll eat first. Around about the same sort of time, Euripides is writing a number of plays which include our only example of a satyr play, the fourth element in a tragic trilogy that was a comic play involving the satyrs, the servants of Dionysus. And that play is a version of the Cyclops incident, clearly a parody, clearly playing with and interrogating some of the issues that arise in that section of the Odyssey. And Odysseus, when he turns up at the island of the Cyclops, poses as just a wandering sailor needing provisions. So, parodying again slightly the question about, oh, strangers, who are you? He says, well, you strangers, can you find us somewhere where we can get water? Is anyone willing to sell provisions to needy sailors? He uses the Greek word nautiloi, not a particularly common word, but used of sailors, particularly on ships that are engaged in naval warfare. When the Cyclops turns up into his cave and sees them, he says, what's this? Who's this crowd near my cave? Have some pirates, lestai, or robbers, Clopes, landed here? So you can see Euripides playing with the, are Odysseus and his crew soldiers, sailors, or maybe pirates? Shortly afterwards, beginning probably of the 4th century BC, as Thucydides is trying to complete his great work on the Peloponnesian War, he writes a preface to the whole thing in which he is arguing that the Peloponnesian War is the greatest war that ever took place. And he has to therefore dismiss the, to the Greeks, historical Trojan War as not such a big affair. And one of the ways he does that is by saying, well, if you look at it, yes, they spent 10 years there, but most of the time they were actually trying to supply themselves and feed themselves. And one of the ways they did that was raiding around the areas of the Chersonese and the areas around Troy and plundering. So he concludes, if they'd come with lots of supplies and focused just on Troy in the first place, without the interruptions of piracy, lestea, the word he uses, on farming, they could have prevailed easily and taken the whole city. So here you have Thucydides, Athenian general, looking back through history and saying, perhaps, well, the Trojan War was just one big pirate raid, really. And the famous ancient scholiasts, the various scholars who added their comments to manuscripts and texts of the Homeric poems, also looked at this question. I've just picked out one, which is particularly to the point, I think. One of the scholiasts writing about the Odyssey episode in the Cyclops cave and drawing attention to the fact that Odysseus chooses 12 of his best companions to go with him, says, well, why did they only choose 12? Well, the answer is, being so few, they would not seem to have come as pirates. Different ways in which you can interpret the same episode and look at the same question. Is Odysseus a pirate? Is he the leader of a pirate crew? Getting this back to a more general sense, I think it depends on what you want piracy to be. And my good friend Vincent Gabrielson, in an article, I put a bibliography as a final slide for this, an article he published in 2001, has drawn attention to the fact of ancient warfare being a lot about raiding and plundering. And he coins this phrase, the raid mentality. Raiding to plunder and devastate enemy territory was a common tactic in ancient warfare. In fact, if you read accounts like the history of the Peloponnesian War and other narratives of ancient warfare with an eye for what's happening on a regular basis, you'll see that raiding and plundering is probably the principal way of conducting warfare. armed robbery, quite often involving ships, but you classify it as warfare. This is how we get the development of a distinction between what might be called legitimate warfare and illegitimate piracy, because once the states involved in warfare become larger, their relationships with each other become more complex, and the idea of just raiding as a way of conducting warfare is lost or subsumed under larger strategic and political objectives. You get a clear conceptual distinction, I think, between warfare which can be considered legitimate and that which is considered illegitimate raiding and plundering, which is piracy. And you get accusations of piracy or supporting pirates used to politically delegitimize some people, and the actions against them or the actions to punish those supporting pirates used as a way to legitimize political entities, leaders, and whole states in both historiographical and political writing in the ancient world. So you get to the point where the suppression of piracy, as the label is applied to those whom you wish to delegitimize or illegitimize, that can then become a legitimization of your own power, your own raiding, your own warfare, and ultimately imperialism. If you want to read more about that, see my published works. But I'd like to get you back to the basic question, or rather the possible answer to the basic question: is Odysseus a pirate? Well, it essentially depends on whether or not you want him to be one. It depends on the point of view you choose to take and how you apply that subjective label. And I am therefore done. Thank you.
For a very wide-ranging talk. So we have time for discussion, and I'll open the floor to questions. Jonathan.
Thank you very much. That's an interesting paper. And I might make quickly two points. The pirate stories from 14 and 17, was it? Those are some of the lying tales. So he didn't actually do that stuff. But it's interesting that this elite aristocratic hero is so readily able to imagine being either a merchant, which is below his class, or a pirate. And maybe your point is very good. Maybe these elite aristocratic warriors are more like pirates, and certainly that seems to be part of the method. The other little point I'd make, I can't help but note that in Odyssey 9 and elsewhere in the Odyssey, there is this verb pirato or parazzo, pi epsilon iota rho, which can mean simply to check something out, check some people out. And it's featured in the second half of the poem, where Athena tells Odysseus that he should be testing the suitors and Eumaios and Penelope. So it can have sort of there's a range of meaning. But I think it's also used in the Polyphemos episode when Odysseus says, I'd like to go and see who's there, sort of check them out. And it seems innocent enough, engage with them. But it turns out to be something much more violent. And it turns out at the beginning, the companions say, hey, let's just grab all these, the guy's not here who lives here in the cave, let's just grab all the livestock. So, and Odysseus said, we should have done that in hindsight. So, it almost does become a pirate, right?
Yes, it's one of the more subtle elements of the whole Polyphemus episode is what are the intentions of Odysseus and his crew when they head towards the Cyclops cave. And it's one of the things that is played. You certainly look as though you have been behaving like pirates, because I can see you taking all of my livestock and my stuff away. Yes. That perao verb becomes a verb used regularly for people who make attempts, particularly to take stuff away, and it becomes it's the word that gives us the basis of perates, first attested, as far as I can see, in the 4th century BC in Greek literature and particularly epigraphy. And that is the word that Cicero in the 1st century BC turns into the Latin term piratus, from which we get pirate. But the ambivalence as to whether or not you're talking about legitimate or illegitimate attempts and plundering, whether or not this is something to condemn, persists with the Greek use of the word perates right through the Hellenistic period. And it's only when we get to Cicero, when we get to the Latin term piratus, that you have a word which is exclusively used of those whose raiding and plundering using ships you consider illegitimate.
Naomi, please.
I wondered if we could talk a little bit about the Kikonians incident. As the first stop of Odysseus's itinerary, as he's telling the story to the Phaeacians, it seems like a strange kind of introduction to the tale where he's engaged in plundering and violence as he's trying to persuade the Phaeacians to help him arrive home. And I was wondering whether it's because the Kikonians were allies of the Trojans that it's justified, or because of his aristocratic status, it is also justified. But it just seems like a very odd tale to kind of start out a persuasive story to try to influence people to help him.
Yes, and there are different ways you can interpret that. One way of looking at it is this is the beginning of the literal and metaphorical journey of Odysseus from the Iliad's sacker of cities to the man who has turned up on Phaeacian land with absolutely nothing, but has to somehow assert his status, show that he is worthy of being treated as a great figure and an honored guest, but has also changed so that he now no longer, in a sense, deserves the wrath that Zeus has caused all his problems, but can become the deliverer of the wrath of Zeus to the suitors. So the Kikonians episode presents Odysseus as you would expect him, sacker of cities. He goes and sacks a city, but with one for whom problems are going to cause increasing, if you like, loss of that simple status and bring him into a world full of complex and quite contradictory challenges. And it's therefore, I think, reasonable to refer to the little story that Penelope tells about Antinoös's father. That's the wrong sort of raiding by sea that deserves to be punished, because in a sense, she's saying what all of you suitors are doing now is that sort of thing as well. And it's one of the subtle ways in which the poet says, and your fate is coming to get you.
Thank you. I'm just not sure if I'm remembering the passage correctly from the Odyssey, but if I have it right, the night before Odysseus wakes up in the morning and takes his 12 brave men over to check out the island, if I remember, he's on a very well-provisioned island. He talks about how verdant it is, how there's nobody there to bother them. The livestock are pretty well coming down from the hills and sacrifices themselves up for dinner. So if you see Odysseus as a military leader charged with getting his fleet of men safely home from the Trojan War, then it seems as though the passage to the Cyclops' island is a backwards diversion away from the objective. It's a dalliance, a curiosity, or a piracy. And I'm wondering if that sort of plays with people's view on the Cyclops Island, on if that's indicting of Odysseus, that he's off mission, he's satisfying his own personal curiosity or vanity as opposed to getting home.
he certainly ends up losing 6 members of his crew in the process. But does that sometimes weigh against him that he's deliberately taken a step away from the homecoming mission?
Yes, it's one of the things the Scholiasts try to work out. Why do they do this at all? What is the point of all of this? And I have yet to summon up the courage to offer anyone an alternative presentation of mine, which is called Odysseus the Egypt. Egypt being the Irish colloquial term for fool who does all sorts of stupid things, particularly as a military commander. As a military commander, Odysseus is a disaster.
Yeah.
No wonder his men don't want to do what he says. He leads them to nothing but trouble. But that, of course, is one of the themes of the whole poem. And it's one of those anti-war, anti-hero, anti-elite culture elements that you can read out of various parts, not just of the Odyssey, but also the Iliad. Why do we follow idiots like this?
Ivana, please.
So thank you very much for the presentation. Could you elaborate, because I never could understand, what is the point of asking someone, kind sir, are you a trader or are you a pirate? I mean, how would that conversation continue if someone were to say, well, yes, I am a pirate? I mean, would the pirate actually be expected to say, I am a pirate, and in fact, if you don't give me stuff, we are going to raid you? Is that what's going on?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, that is the key question. I can't give you what I would consider a definitive answer, but I take comfort from the fact that nobody ever seems to have come up with a good answer to that. And one of the earliest people who is puzzled by it and tries to rationalize it is Thucydides, who says, well, they must have been raiding and being like pirates all the time back in early days because they're constantly being asked this question. But it's asked in very odd situations. I think what we have to understand there is that this is one of the moral crux elements that you get in the Odyssey, particularly. What kind of a person in a ship with warriors are you? Or what kind of a person are you more generally? Are you the kind who is going out to behave reasonably, trade and interact with people like a trader? Or are you the kind of person who is going to attack, kill, grab what they can and run away? It's put first to Telemachus. And I think that is quite important as a way of establishing these what kind of a person are you parameters, because we already know that Telemachus is, so to speak, a good guy. He's not coming to do harm to others. And so although from a sort of logical point of view, it jars when the question is asked when they've already been welcomed effectively as guests, it makes it easy for the answer to be, well, of course, I'm a good person and this is why I've come here. When then the question is put by the Cyclops, you get a slightly different jarring, because we've already been told that the Cyclopses are essentially amoral, that they don't respect any of the rules of Zeus regarding hospitality, regarding how to treat with others. And it's a particularly foolish question coming from Polyphemos, because we've already been told that the Cyclops don't trade with anyone. How would he even know? But clearly there was a formula that poets liked to use, and it was, in a sense, an encapsulation of the what kind of moral stance are you taking and what kind of moral stance should be taken towards you. Polyphemos, in a sense, gives the wrong answer to his own question by failing to treat Odysseus and his companions respectfully. But on the other hand, they can be considered to have deserved it because they probably haven't treated Polyphemos and his goods and his animals respectfully. I like it as an unanswerable question, Think about this. What kind of interaction do you have with others? And remember, of course, Homeric poetry is meant to be addressed to listeners.
It reminds one of the famous immigration question that you have to answer when entering the United States. Are you coming to engage in prostitution? And then if you are a liar and a prostitute.
I'm reminded of a dear departed friend who some of you will know, Getzel Cohen, a Canadian, who, as you can guess from his name, when asked the question, "Are you a member of the Nazi Party?" could not really give a straight-faced answer. He told me that when he was faced with that question, because it was part of the interview process for becoming an American citizen, he said, "I don't think they would have me."
Thank you. Micah.
So by having Polyphemos ask the Odysseus and his men if they're pirates, is that using the term of pirate in the same way it was used politically as justification for his actions against them? Because then he can say that they're no longer guests. He doesn't have to offer them xenia, because clearly they're pirates here to raid his belongings.
That's very perceptive of you, because, of course, I've done a sleight of hand. Yes, the word lesterès is the word that we can translate as pirates, and it's one of the words in ancient Greek that becomes part of the political labeling of illegitimate plunderers. But at the point at which it's being presented in the Homeric poems, and I think also where you see that word in the Homeric hymns in the 6th century, although there is a sense of those who can be called lesterès are raiding for their own benefit and bringing harm to others, there's not a clear distinction yet between legitimate raiding for political warfare purposes and illegitimate raiding that we could label piracy, because that conceptual distinction is still in the process of emerging. And it has to do with the way in which states begin to claim a monopoly on legitimate uses of violence. So one way of answering your question is to say, at the point at which it's asked, it's still a very ambiguous label.
I think actually for the purposes of time, we should probably move on, although we could obviously continue the discussion. So please join me in thanking Phil.
Could I just say thank you all very much indeed. Unfortunately, I have to go. I would love to join in further discussions, but things just didn't work out for me. Thank you very much for an excellent set of questions that have given me even more things now to think about. Thank you very much indeed.